Imagine dropping your 7-year-old son off at what looks like a military compound. You know you'll barely see him for the next 13 years. He'll sleep on a bed of reeds, fight other kids for scraps of food, and learn that showing pain means weakness. This wasn't some dystopian nightmare. This was Tuesday in ancient Sparta, and by the time these boys became men, they'd become something the ancient world had never seen before. A professional warrior class that would make grown men flee at the mere sight of their bronze shields. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel, and if you truly enjoy stories like this, consider liking and subscribing. Thanks so much. Now back to the story. The process began before these boys could even walk properly. At age 7, when most kids today are learning to tie their shoes, Spartan boys were taken from their mothers in a ceremony called the agoge. But here's what's really striking. This wasn't some cruel punishment. Spartan families actually took pride in this moment. The state inspectors would arrive at your home and evaluate your son. If he were deemed physically fit, he'd be assigned to a group called a buwa, essentially his military unit for the next 2 decades. These weren't just random groupings either. Each buwa had about 64 boys, and they'd become closer than brothers because they had to be. What's fascinating is that Spartan mothers allegedly had a saying when they sent their sons off to war: "Come back with your shield or on it." But during the agoge, they had to let go much earlier. The night before their son left for training, families would hold what was essentially a funeral feast, because the boy they knew was about to disappear forever. The boys were marched to communal barracks where they'd live until age 30. Think about that, 23 years away from home. And this is where things get really intense. The Spartans had a philosophy: comfort makes you weak, so we'll remove all comfort. These 7-year-olds were given 1 cloak per year. Not one for winter and one for summer. 1 total. They slept on beds they made themselves from reeds they had to break off with their bare hands from the river. No pillows, no blankets, just rough plant material on a stone floor. But the sleeping arrangements were just the beginning. Food became a weapon in their training. The boys were deliberately given less food than they needed to survive. This wasn't an oversight. It was policy. The idea was to make them resourceful, cunning, and tough. If you wanted to eat properly, you had to steal food. But here's the catch that'll blow your mind. If you got caught stealing, you weren't punished for stealing, you were punished for getting caught. One famous story involves a Spartan boy who stole a fox and hid it under his cloak. When questioned by his instructors, the fox began clawing and biting his stomach. Rather than reveal the theft and face punishment for poor execution, the boy stood there and let the fox literally eat through his flesh until he collapsed and died. Whether this actually happened or not, Spartans told this story with pride. That's the mindset they were cultivating. Physical conditioning was relentless. These kids ran barefoot over rocky terrain until their feet were like leather. They practiced with weapons that were deliberately heavier than what they'd use in actual combat, so real swords and spears would feel light by comparison. Combat training wasn't just about technique. They fought each other, really fought with real consequences. The older boys, called paidonomos, had authority over the younger ones and weren't shy about using it. Beatings were routine, not as punishment, but as conditioning. The goal was to build pain tolerance and eliminate the fear response. They had competitions to see who could endure the most lashes without crying out. Here's something that sounds almost unbelievable. They had an annual ritual at the altar of Artemis where teenage boys would be whipped until the altar was covered in blood. Some boys allegedly died during this ritual, and it was considered an honor. Parents would cheer from the sidelines, hoping their son would show the most endurance. Winter training was particularly brutal. While other Greek city-states scaled back military exercises in cold weather, Spartans intensified them. They'd march through snow with minimal clothing, sleep outdoors in freezing temperatures, and continue combat drills regardless of conditions. What the Spartans were really doing was systematic psychological conditioning on a level that's hard for us to comprehend today. They were taking natural human emotions, fear, pain, attachment, comfort-seeking, and methodically crushing them. The separation from family wasn't just about military training, it was about breaking emotional bonds that might make a warrior hesitate in battle. If you've never experienced unconditional love or comfort, you can't miss what you've never had. These boys learned that their buwa was their only family, and their only identity was as a Spartan warrior. The constant hunger served multiple purposes beyond just physical toughening. Chronic malnutrition during development actually changes brain chemistry. It heightens aggression, reduces empathy, and creates a permanent state of stress alertness. In modern terms, they were creating what we'd recognize as a form of controlled trauma response. The lack of individual possessions or privacy meant these boys never developed a sense of personal identity separate from the group. Your cloak wasn't yours, it belonged to Sparta. Your bed wasn't yours, it was just where Sparta allowed you to sleep. Even your body wasn't yours, it was a weapon belonging to the state. Perhaps most disturbing was how they handled relationships. Emotional attachment to anything other than Sparta was seen as a weakness. Boys who showed homesickness or cried for their mothers were brutally mocked and physically punished until they learned to suppress these feelings entirely. The result was young men who felt no individual fear because they had no individual identity to preserve. Death wasn't something that happened to them, it was just something that happened to a piece of Spartan military equipment that could be replaced. By the time these boys became men, they were unlike anything else in the ancient world. When other Greek armies saw Spartan warriors approaching with their bronze shields glinting and their red cloaks flowing, many would retreat without fighting. The Spartans had earned a psychological advantage before they even drew a weapon. At the Battle of Thermopylae, 300 Spartans held off a Persian force that historians estimate to be between 100,000 and 300,000 soldiers for 3 full days. These weren't superhuman beings, they were the product of this system. They literally didn't know how to retreat because retreat had never been an option in their training. But here's what's really fascinating about the long-term results. This system was incredibly effective at creating soldiers, but it was terrible at creating anything else. Spartans contributed virtually nothing to art, philosophy, literature, or science. While Athens was producing Socrates and Plato, Sparta was producing only warriors. The agoge system created men who were functionally incapable of civilian life. They couldn't farm, couldn't engage in trade, couldn't even handle their own finances. Sparta had to rely on a massive slave population to handle all non-military functions of society. Even more telling, Spartan warriors often struggled with family relationships as adults. They were allowed to marry, but they'd sneak visits to their wives like teenagers sneaking out of the house. Many Spartan men remained more emotionally connected to their military brothers than to their own wives and children. The system eventually contributed to Sparta's downfall. They became so specialized in warfare that they couldn't adapt when military tactics evolved. Their population declined because warriors don't make good farmers or merchants, and eventually other Greek city-states developed new strategies that made Sparta's approach obsolete. Looking back at the Spartan agoge, we see both the remarkable effectiveness of focused training and the dangerous consequences of sacrificing individual humanity for collective military power. These methods produced some of history's most formidable warriors, but at a cost that few societies would consider acceptable today. It raises questions about how far any civilization should go in pursuit of military excellence, and what we lose when we prioritize the state above the individual. The Spartans achieved their goal of creating unbreakable soldiers, but in doing so, they created a society that couldn't sustain itself once the world moved beyond their particular brand of warfare. Perhaps the most lasting lesson is that human systems designed to suppress basic human nature often contain the seeds of their own destruction.